I'm Judge Denise Albright. I've been on this bench for 18 years.
A judge? You? That's cute. It's always the same with you people. Where'd you get that badge? The flea market? eBay?
Call dispatch. Call anyone. They will confirm who
I'm not
I am.
calling anybody. You're going to tell me who you really are. We're going to have a...
At 6:47 p.m. in the underground parking garage of the Jefferson Federal Courthouse, a white police officer slammed a black woman face first onto the hood of her Mercedes. Her glasses flew off and skittered across the concrete. Her briefcase hit the ground, scattering legal documents beneath the wheels of nearby cars. The officer wrenched her arms behind her back and snapped handcuffs onto her wrists so tightly the metal bit into her skin. The woman was Judge Denise Albright, a sitting United States federal district judge with 18 years on the bench. The officer who put his hands on her was Sergeant Vincent Raleigh, a 16-year veteran assigned to courthouse security who had decided in the span of 30 seconds that she didn't belong in the judge's reserved parking section. He never checked her credentials. He never read the nameplate on her parking spot. He saw a black woman near an expensive car and assumed she was a threat. What Raleigh didn't know was that 4 security cameras were recording every second from every angle. Within 72 hours, the FBI would open a civil rights investigation. A police chief would be forced to resign, and Raleigh would face federal charges that would end his career and send him to prison. All because of 11 minutes of footage he didn't know existed. Before we continue, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe because the next story is one you don't want to miss. Sergeant Vincent Raleigh was 44 years old and had been assigned to the courthouse security detail for 6 years. Among colleagues, he was known as strict, a label that in his case meant aggressive stops, invasive questioning, and a particular interest in anyone who didn't look like they belonged. His personnel file told a different story than his reputation suggested. Over 14 years, 31 formal complaints had been filed against him: excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation. Black attorneys had reported being stopped in hallways and asked to prove they were lawyers. Black clerks had been questioned about why they were accessing certain floors. Black visitors had been detained for walking too confidently in spaces Raleigh decided weren't meant for them. None of the complaints ever resulted in discipline. Internal Affairs dismissed every single one as unsubstantiated, never once pulling security footage or interviewing witnesses who had offered to testify. Raleigh was protected. His brother-in-law sat on the city council. His union representatives made clear that pursuing him would create problems. Fellow officers who witnessed his behavior either laughed along or stayed silent out of fear. The system had taught Raleigh that he was untouchable, that his badge allowed him to decide who belonged and who didn't, and that no one would ever hold him accountable. On this evening, in that parking garage, he would finally encounter someone he couldn't intimidate into silence, someone whose word carried more weight than his badge ever could. Judge Denise Albright was 59 years old and had spent her entire life proving she belonged in rooms where people assumed she didn't. She grew up in public housing in Baltimore, the daughter of a bus driver and a hospital cleaner. She was the first in her family to attend college. She graduated from Harvard Law School in the top 10% of her class. She spent 12 years as a federal prosecutor, building a reputation for being meticulous, relentless, and impossible to intimidate. When a Republican president nominated her to the federal bench, she was confirmed 94-6. Senators on both sides called her fair, tough, and exactly what the judiciary needed. In 18 years on the bench, she had earned the respect of colleagues, attorneys, and clerks across ideological lines. Her personal life had demanded just as much strength. Her husband passed away when their daughters were young, and she raised them alone while managing a caseload that would have broken most people. Both daughters were now attorneys. That evening, she had stayed late in her chambers to finish an opinion in a civil rights case. The irony of that would become apparent soon enough. She left at 6:40 p.m., wearing a blazer and slacks, carrying her leather briefcase, her judicial ID badge clipped to her belt in plain view. She walked toward her assigned parking spot, the same spot she had used for 18 years, marked with a sign that read, "Reserved Judge Albright." She had no idea someone was watching her and deciding she didn't belong. The underground parking garage sat 3 levels beneath the Jefferson Federal Courthouse. The reserved section for judges and senior staff occupied the area closest to the elevator bank, well lit and monitored by security cameras mounted on every concrete pillar. At 6:42 p.m., Sergeant Vincent Raleigh sat in his patrol vehicle near the elevator, scrolling through his phone, handling personal business on department time. He wasn't watching the monitors. He wasn't conducting rounds. He glanced up when he heard footsteps echoing across the concrete. What he saw was a black woman walking toward a Mercedes in the judge's section. His mind filled in the rest. She didn't belong. Possible car thief. Maybe a cleaning lady who wandered into the wrong area and got ideas. What he chose to ignore told the real story. Her professional attire. The ID badge clearly visible on her belt. Her confident stride toward a specific vehicle. The walk of someone who had made this trip 1,000 times. The nameplate on the parking spot directly in front of her. Raleigh set his phone down and opened his door. He had already decided what was happening and who she was. He stepped out of his vehicle and moved to intercept her before she could reach her car door. Above him, 4 security cameras recorded every step, capturing angles he never thought to consider, preserving footage that would eventually cost him everything. Raleigh's voice echoed off the concrete walls before Judge Albright could reach her car door. "Stop right there. This area is restricted. What are you doing down here?" She turned to face him, her expression calm, her posture unchanged. "I'm parked here." "This is my vehicle." Raleigh stepped closer, one hand resting on his duty belt, his eyes scanning her with open suspicion. "I'm going to need to see some identification. This section is for judges only." Judge Albright glanced down at the judicial ID badge clipped to her belt, clearly visible, then looked back at him. She pointed to it. "I'm Judge Denise Albright. I've been parking here for almost 2 decades. Raleigh looked at the badge for half a second, then scoffed. "Anyone can buy a fake badge. I need real ID, driver's license, now." Her voice remained measured, controlled. "Officer, I'm telling you who I am. You can verify this with a single phone call to courthouse security." His expression hardened. "Lady, I don't know who you think you are, but you're in a restricted area and you're being evasive. That's suspicious behavior." The accusation hung in the air. A federal judge with 18 years on the bench, standing 10 feet from a parking spot with her name on it, being told she was acting suspicious for existing in a space she had every right to occupy. Judge Albright took a slow breath, keeping her movements deliberate and visible. She began reaching toward her purse to retrieve her driver's license. Raleigh's hand shot up. "Keep your hands where I can see them. Don't reach for anything." She stopped, her hand frozen mid-motion. "Officer, you asked for identification. I'm complying with your request." "You're being combative," he snapped. "You're resisting." The contradiction was absurd. He had demanded ID, then prevented her from producing it. Near the elevator, a court clerk had just stepped out and stopped cold, watching the confrontation unfold. 50 feet away, a security guard stood frozen at his booth, unsure whether to intervene. Raleigh's voice rose. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle. Now, I'm not asking again." Judge Albright held his gaze, her voice steady but firm. "I am a federal judge. You are making a serious mistake. I am asking you to verify my identity before this goes any further." Raleigh stepped into her space, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "I don't take orders from you." The security cameras kept recording, capturing every word, every movement, every second of what was about to happen next. Raleigh grabbed Judge Albright's arm and spun her around with enough force to knock her off balance. Before she could steady herself, he shoved her forward, slamming her face first onto the hood of her own Mercedes. The impact was brutal. Her cheek struck the metal with a dull thud. Her glasses flew off and skittered across the concrete, one lens cracking against a pillar. Her briefcase hit the ground and burst open, scattering legal documents beneath the surrounding cars. He wrenched her arms behind her back, twisting them at an angle that sent pain shooting through her shoulders. The handcuffs clicked shut too tight, the metal edges biting into the skin of her wrists. "You're hurting me," she said, her voice strained but controlled. "I am not resisting." "This is assault." Raleigh leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. "You should have cooperated. People like you always make it difficult." The words hung in the air, captured perfectly by the security cameras still recording from 4 angles. Every frame showed the same undeniable truth: her compliance, his aggression, violence without justification. Near the elevator, the court clerk had her phone out, hands trembling as she recorded. The security guard was on his radio, calling for backup. And stepping out of the elevator, stopping dead in his tracks at the scene before him, was another judge. Senior Judge Franklin Holloway was 71 years old with 30 years on the federal bench. He had seen a lot in his career, but nothing prepared him for the sight of his colleague pinned to the hood of her car by a uniformed officer. He moved faster than a man his age should, closing the distance in seconds. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice boomed across the garage. "That's Judge Albright." Raleigh didn't release his grip. "Sir, step back. This doesn't concern you." Holloway's face flushed red with fury. "I'm Senior Judge Franklin Holloway. Take those handcuffs off her immediately. She's been on this bench longer than you've been wearing that uniform." For the first time, Raleigh hesitated. His eyes flicked between Holloway and the woman still pressed against the car. The security guard arrived, slightly out of breath. "Sergeant, that's Judge Albright. Her parking spot is right there." He pointed at the sign less than 5 feet away. "Her name is on it." Raleigh's expression shifted. Not remorse, not shame, fear. The fear of a man who suddenly realized he had made a mistake he couldn't undo. He released his grip and stepped back, already formulating his defense. "She wasn't cooperating. She was being suspicious. I was following protocol." No one in that garage believed him, and the cameras had already recorded the truth. Raleigh reached for the handcuffs with reluctant hands, unlocking them slowly as if delaying the moment might somehow change what he had done. The metal fell away, revealing deep red marks already forming on Judge Albright's wrists, indentations where the cuffs had bitten into her skin. She did not yell, she did not cry. She stepped away from the hood of her car, rolled her shoulders once, and bent down to retrieve her glasses from the concrete. One lens was cracked straight through the middle. She picked up her scattered documents one by one, placing them back into her briefcase with steady hands. Then she straightened her blazer, brushed the dust from her sleeves, and turned to face Raleigh with an expression that carried more weight than any outburst ever could. "Badge number and name. Now." Her voice was calm, precise, and absolutely unwavering. Raleigh stammered out the information. Behind him, Judge Holloway was already on his phone, speaking rapidly to the chief judge of the district, then immediately calling the U.S. Marshals. He pointed at the security guard. "Get your supervisor down here now. I want every second of footage from this garage preserved. Nothing gets deleted. Nothing gets overwritten." Judge Albright's voice cut through the chaos. "I want this documented. Every frame. I want his entire personnel history pulled. And I want the FBI notified tonight." Raleigh stood frozen, suddenly surrounded by people who outranked everyone he had ever known, and every single one of them was furious. The FBI's Civil Rights Division opened an investigation within 12 hours. The charges under consideration were severe: assault of a federal official, deprivation of rights under color of law. The security footage was the foundation of everything. 11 minutes of crystal-clear video from 4 separate angles, showing the entire encounter from the moment Raleigh exited his patrol car to the moment the handcuffs came off. There was no ambiguity. Judge Albright had been compliant, calm, and clearly identifiable throughout. Her ID badge was visible in every frame. Her parking spot, marked with her name, appeared in 2 of the camera angles. Raleigh had been aggressive from his first words, dismissive of her credentials, and violent without any justification. The audio was even more damning. Every word had been captured, including "people like you always make it difficult." Federal investigators marked it immediately as evidence of racial bias. The police department attempted damage control. The chief released a statement calling it a misunderstanding and citing proper protocol for suspicious persons. Federal investigators shut that down within hours. This was not a misunderstanding. This was assault, captured on camera, with clear evidence of discriminatory intent. The 31 previous complaints against Raleigh were reopened. For the first time, witnesses were actually interviewed. Patterns that had been ignored for years were finally documented. Investigators discovered that at least 19 other black professionals had been stopped, detained, or humiliated by Raleigh at the courthouse over 6 years. Not one of their complaints had ever been taken seriously, until now. The security footage became public 3 weeks after federal charges were confirmed. Media outlets obtained it legally through Freedom of Information Act requests, and within 48 hours, the video had reached 5 million views. The image of a federal judge pinned face down on the hood of her own car, a uniformed officer pressing her into the metal, became iconic overnight. National outrage followed. The legal community issued statements of condemnation. Civil rights organizations called for systemic reform. Judicial associations across the country demanded accountability not just for Raleigh, but for every supervisor who had enabled him. The "people like you" moment became the defining clip. Networks played it on loop. Commentators analyzed the tone, the words, the casual cruelty of a man who believed he was untouchable. It encapsulated everything wrong with racial profiling in a single sentence. Previous victims began coming forward. Black attorneys who had been stopped in courthouse hallways shared their stories publicly for the first time. Paralegals described being questioned about their right to access certain floors. Courthouse employees recounted years of humiliation they had learned to endure in silence. The patterns were undeniable. The police union initially defended Raleigh, calling his actions consistent with procedure for suspicious persons. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Within 72 hours, the union retracted its statement. Then came the revelation that destroyed the department's credibility entirely. Internal Affairs had never once pulled security footage when investigating complaints against Raleigh. Not once in 31 complaints over 14 years. The cover-up was systemic, and now it was exposed. Federal prosecutors moved quickly. Sergeant Vincent Raleigh was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law under 18 U.S.C. Section 242 and assault of a federal official under 18 U.S.C. Section 111. Additional charges followed as investigators documented the pattern of civil rights violations spanning 6 years. Conspiracy charges remained under consideration. The arrest happened at 6:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Federal agents arrived at Raleigh's home, cuffed him in his driveway, and walked him past the television cameras that had been tipped off just early enough to capture every moment. The uniform he had used as a weapon for 16 years was gone. He wore a gray sweatshirt and the expression of a man who still couldn't believe the system had turned against him. His brother-in-law, the city councilman who had helped shield him for years, released a statement within hours distancing himself completely. Political survival mattered more than family loyalty. The police chief resigned 3 days later after federal investigators revealed he had personally dismissed 3 complaints against Raleigh without any review. 2 internal affairs officers were suspended pending criminal referral for obstruction, accused of deliberately failing to investigate complaints they knew had merit. Raleigh's attorney issued a statement claiming his client was just doing his job and had followed standard protocol. The footage made that defense impossible. 11 minutes of video showing a compliant woman being brutalized for no reason other than the color of her skin. No procedure justified what those cameras captured. The federal trial lasted 4 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The jury watched the 1-minute security footage in full, multiple times, from all 4 angles. They saw Raleigh approach a calm, professional woman. They saw him dismiss her credentials. They saw him slam her onto the hood of her car. They heard "people like you" in crystal clear audio. Judge Albright took the stand and testified with quiet dignity. She described the humiliation of being thrown against her own vehicle in the building where she had served for 18 years. She described the pain that shot through her shoulders as her arms were wrenched behind her back. She described the violation of being treated as a criminal in her own workplace by a man who never once considered she might be telling the truth. 14 of the 19 identified victims testified after her. Black attorneys who had been stopped and interrogated, paralegals who had been accused of trespassing in their own offices, courthouse employees who had suffered in silence for years because no one in power would listen. Their stories filled the courtroom, one after another, establishing a pattern that could no longer be denied. Use of force experts testified that Raleigh's actions violated every standard of professional policing. The defense attempted to argue reasonable suspicion, but the footage destroyed every claim before it could take hold. Raleigh had refused a plea deal, insisting he had done nothing wrong, demanding his day in court. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing drew national media coverage. Every seat in the courtroom was filled. Reporters lined the hallway outside. Judge Albright delivered her impact statement with the same composure she had shown in that parking garage. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She spoke not for herself, but for every black professional who had ever been presumed not to belong, every person who had been stopped, questioned, and humiliated for existing in spaces they had earned the right to occupy. Other victims followed. 14 statements read into the record, stories of being traumatized and silenced for years, finally heard in a courtroom where their words carried legal weight. The presiding judge, a white woman with 25 years on the federal bench, delivered remarks that left no room for ambiguity. She condemned the systemic failures that had allowed Raleigh to operate unchecked. She condemned the culture of impunity that protected abusive officers. She condemned the institutional racism embedded in a department that had dismissed 31 complaints without once reviewing available evidence. The sentence was 5 years and 4 months in federal prison, one of the longest sentences for a police civil rights conviction in the district's history. Raleigh sat motionless as the words were read, his face pale, his eyes unfocused. He had never believed the system he served would actually hold him accountable. He was wrong. The message was clear. Badges are not shields against justice. The civil lawsuit followed the criminal conviction. Judge Albright filed against the city and the police department, and the case never reached trial. The evidence was too damning, the liability too clear. The settlement was $3.2 million plus sweeping institutional reforms that would reshape how the department operated for years to come. The mandated changes were extensive. An independent oversight board with full subpoena power, mandatory bias training for every officer with quarterly assessments, automatic footage review for all citizen complaints, eliminating the discretion that had allowed supervisors to bury inconvenient evidence, a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory enforcement, with termination as the mandatory consequence. A separate compensation fund of $750,000 was established for Raleigh's other victims, the 19 black professionals whose complaints had been dismissed, ignored, and filed away for years. It was an acknowledgement, long overdue, that the system had failed them. Judge Albright used a portion of her settlement to establish the Albright Justice Initiative, a foundation providing legal support for victims of police misconduct and funding body camera accountability programs across the country. She returned to the bench the week after the sentencing, taking her seat with the same diligence and precision she had always brought to her work. But now she was something more, a national symbol of what happens when power meets accountability. The final irony was impossible to ignore. The security cameras that recorded Raleigh's assault were courthouse equipment, installed to protect judges and staff from outside threats. Raleigh had activated his own body camera that day, out of habit. The very systems meant to ensure safety became the evidence that ended his career and sent him to prison. Now, watching footage like this, it can really stick with you, right? Some of these clips stay in your head, especially late at night when you're trying to fall asleep. And, speaking of sleep, if you're someone who lies awake at 2 or 3 a.m., mind racing, unable to shut off, I know how frustrating that is. You're exhausted, but your brain just won't stop. And the worst part? The less you sleep, the worse it gets. Your energy crashes, your mood suffers. Everything feels harder than it should. I struggled with this for years. Tried melatonin, white noise, warm milk, nothing worked long term. Then I found something called the 3-0 Day Uninterrupted Sleep Reset. It's a science-based program, no pills, no medication, that actually retrains your brain to sleep through the night. 7 to 8 hours, uninterrupted. Over 30 days, it rewires your sleep system. And once you're done, you keep the results. There's a maintenance plan so you don't slip back. Look, if you've tried everything and nothing sticks, this is different. Check the link in the description. Seriously, try it, and I'll catch you in the next story.